Welcome to episode 43 of the Cycling Europe podcast. My name is Andrew Sykes. Now, back in 2021, I put out a call for anyone who was interested in recording a short monologue about their experiences of cycling to get in touch. I made the brief very broad. It could be about a country, a cycle route, a cyclist, basically anything cycling related. And in the past year or so, quite a few people have come forward to record such a monologue. The first of those monologues appeared in episode 32, and it was recorded by Laura Massey-Pugh, who talked about her plans to cycle around the world on a tandem. When editing the podcasts, I've tended to squeeze in the monologue either in the middle of the main interview or at the end of the podcast, simply because they've been relatively short, which is a pity, as they certainly deserve to have headline status. So, to right that wrong, this episode of the podcast has been flipped over, and the monologues have become the main feature. If you missed them before, you're going to have a second opportunity to hear Laura talk about Stellar Tandem, Laurence Warren tell the story of round-the-world cyclist Colin Martin, as well as discuss his experiences of cycling in his adopted home of Austria, Robin Watkins talk about cycling in Czechia, the poet Caroline Burrows reflect lyrically upon her commute to work, and Simon Garland recount his experiences of cycling the EuroVelo 15, otherwise known as the Rhine Cycle Route. Sprinkled between the monologues is an interview I recorded around the time of the COP26 conference last November with a chap called Gavin Wood. He works in my corner of the world, that's West Yorkshire in the north of England, as an active travel advisor, and we chatted about the challenges of building infrastructure and changing minds in order that we can all live in a much more cycling-friendly place. I'll be back at the end of the podcast to round off this monologue-focused episode, so enjoy once again the words of Laura, Laurence, Caroline and Robin, with the thoughts of Gavin squeezed in between, all glued together with the usual of the bell. We start, however, with one of my favourite monologues. It was recorded by Simon Garland about his two-wheeled escapade along the Rhine. Over to you, Simon.
Hello there. My name is Simon Garland. I'm 54 and live on the Wirral, Merseyside. Back in October 2019, I cycled EuroVelo 15 solo, back in those heady days where you could visit 7 different countries on one trip without being treated like Typhoid Mary. Episode 33 featured a great interview with Harriet and Matt Hall, who cycled EuroVelo 15 and sound like very competent and accomplished cyclists. In fact, all the podcast guests sound competent, hardy, and the sort of person you'd want at your side in a tight spot. I may be about to buck the trend. I'm pretty useless at bike maintenance. I like cycling and camping, but can't be bothered doing both. I'm in my 6th decade and left that nonsense behind. Attempting to sleep on a piece of foam laid across last season's unharvested turnips and lying awake trying to pick the uncooked bits of pasta from my teeth, listening to the earnest philosophy of the stoned students in the tent next door, is poor reward for 10 hours of exercise and lousy preparation for the next 10, to my mind. Don't judge me, and don't pick on people who pay to have someone carry their bags for them either. If your idea of real cycle touring is to make it as uncomfortable as possible, I'll guarantee there'll be someone looking down on you from a saddle made of sandpaper. And while we're here, don't get me started on wild camping, or as it's known to the rest of the world, trespassing. Maybe trying to sleep unwashed and illegally in a field full of weird animal noises while all your batteries die is your idea of fun. Me, this sort of thing turns cycling anecdotes into a 2-wheeled version of the Four Yorkshiremen sketch. A tent, bloomin' luxury. We had to bivouac in a Kosovan minefield by a village overrun by wolves. That's real cycle touring, lad. Quite. So, back to EuroVelo 15. Preparation is the key, I'd say. I just wish I'd done some. Well, a bit more. For example, I was aware the Hook van Holland metro wasn't working, but it helps to know if it's 20 kilometres or 20 miles from the ferry terminal to Rotterdam Central if you're hoping to catch a particular train. I didn't, and I didn't. However, while you're riding through one of the busiest ports in the world, here are a few things to look out for. The Rosenberg Wall is a windbreak for ships. It's made up of 125 concrete cylindrical slabs, each one 25 metres tall and 18 metres wide. It's an industrial photography student's wet dream. There's the Maceland Carrying, which is a storm surge gate and one of the largest moving structures on Earth. And as you approach Rotterdam, you can cross under the river through the Maas Tunnel in a floor dedicated to cyclists. Top tip number 2 is to read what it says on your train ticket. A well-meaning fellow cyclist saw me preparing to get off at Basel and urged me to hang fire as the central station was a stop further on. It turned out that in fact Basel SBB was bad and Basel Bad was in fact good. I arrived in Andermatt 2 hours late and from a totally different direction. Tip number 3 is to pack some walking shoes and a hat. This was so I could visit Lake Thoma, the source of the Rhine, which is a 2-hour hike from Oberalp Pass. Where did I fit the walking shoes, you ask? Well, I wasn't carrying a tent, carry mat or frying pan. Fully laden, my panniers still weighed 21 kilograms, which was mostly underpants and whiskey. Look, we've already established that preparation isn't my forte. But this leads me to tip number 4, which I learned before setting off. I trained for 6 months by putting weights in my panniers for my commute to work. The bike is a 2002 Orbit Harrier with side pull brakes. We all know the principle. Rubber brake blocks press against the wheel rims and friction slows the bike down. With time, the rubber wears down and the blocks need replacing. What I hadn't understood well enough until this trip is that friction works both ways, and that just as the rubber wears down over months, the aluminium of your wheel rim also wears down over years, and the heavier the bike and its load, I'm 6'4", the more pronounced this erosion. My bike mechanic informed me that had it continued, the rims would have thinned and exploded, and my wheel would have suffered a total catastrophic failure. Tip 4. If you haven't got disc brakes, check your wheel rims. The journey proper starts at Oberalp Pass, and I don't think I pedalled for the first 15 kilometres. That's the fun bit. Not so much fun is the absence of dedicated cycle paths, and the worst part for this coincides with the most spectacular views of all EuroVelo 15. Ruina Alta has been called Europe's Grand Canyon. It was formed by a rock slide 10,000 years ago when 12 cubic kilometres of rock went for a walk. I'm unsure which was more exhilarating, the view into the gorge from 500 metres up, or meeting an oncoming juggernaut down a dark one-vehicle tunnel. I can't claim to be a fan of the town Chur. My friend who works at the UN in Vienna tells me that to pronounce it properly you need to sound like you're clearing something repellent from the back of your throat. It's an army town full of young men with semi-automatic rifles, and the sound of gunfire from the local ranges. Surely if there's one army in the world who could do without firearms and defend themselves with, I don't know, knives, surely it's the Swiss army? North of Chur is where Heidi was set, and they call it Heidiland. It's all vineyards and cowbells. Further on, Vaduz in Liechtenstein is lovely, but bear in mind the population has the highest income per capita in the world. If you've seen the James Bond movie Quantum of Solace, you'll recognise the Seebühne at Bregenz. It's the opera stage on the shore of Lake Constance, or the Bodensee, and the productions are famous for their surrealist sets, huge clown heads or a massive single eye. During lockdown, I've been working in my kitchen, but I'm often to be caught looking wistfully at the webcam footage from the town of Lindau on the north shore of the Bodensee, out across the lake and over to the Alps. It's a magical place. Look up in fine weather and you'll more than likely see zeppelins. Not just airships, actual zeppelins. Friedrichshafen is still home to the Zeppelin Company, and the museum has a mock-up of the Hindenburg passenger quarters for you to walk around. Would you believe it had a Rauchzimmer? A smoking room? These days they're building the European Space Agency's next Jupiter probe. Oh, the humanity. It's a ferry ride south to Constance. From here on, huge black-on-white kilometre markers tell you how far downriver you are from Constance Bridge. Those markers become the cycle tourist's friend over the next week or so. It's funny how when consulting a map at home you think some parts are going to be boring, and the stretch between Constance and Basel seemed nondescript. In fact, this was my favourite part. It's mostly flat, easy, scenic, and every now and again throws up an unexpected marvel. Stein am Rhein is a medieval town with bright frescoes painted onto buildings. I discovered it by accident. Similarly, I put a pin in a map and booked a guest house in Neuhausen, totally unaware that this was the home to the largest waterfall in Europe. For this stretch, you're constantly crossing the border between Switzerland and Germany, as my phone kept alerting me. I've no idea how they've closed it for lockdown, seeing as some checkpoints are just lone unmanned barriers in the middle of a forest. There's even a bona fide enclave just before Schaffhausen. Büsingen am Hochrhein is a tiny piece of Germany totally surrounded by Switzerland. Tip number 5. If you can, go off-season. This was October and the combine harvesters were still out reaping wheat. It was 32 degrees C and I got sunburned. It only rained twice in 3 weeks. That said, I took a water bottle and hardly used it. And on the subject of hydration, well, how best to put this? I'm a bloke in his mid-50s. In autumn, there are fewer people, so more opportunities for that clandestine pee. Off-season also means that I had the whole dormitory to myself in hostels. The only disadvantage was in Holland, where the authorities perform maintenance on the polders and dikes, meaning that sometimes I'd be diverted from the bike path. 2 things to do in Basel: eat raclette and buy a Vickel fish. The former is an indulgent cheesy cousin to fondue, and the latter is a waterproof bag for your valuables that you take with you out into the river. It's not so much swimming as being carried by the current. There's an allocated safe lane, which doesn't make the passing of coal barges in the next lane any less terrifying. I managed to get lost leaving Basel, so missed the triangular border between Germany, Switzerland and France. However, this brings me to tip 6. Don't become too dependent on your phone data. I'm not going to name names, but a certain phone provider, whose name is an anagram of TB, has consistently failed to fulfill its contract to provide me with data in certain European countries, and France was one of them. A combination of no map on my phone and an unexpected canal took me 30 kilometres off course. The solution was simply to stay on the German side once I'd found it again. Like a Blanche Dubois in Lycra, I do rely on the kindness of strangers on these trips. With just one exception, everyone I spoke to was helpful and friendly. However, there is a special place in hell reserved for one particular hotel receptionist in Germersheim, just south of Speyer. I'll say no more. Mannheim is home to the largest chemical plant in Europe. You're allowed to go swimming and fish downriver of it, but I can't say I was tempted. The range of bikes was huge. Tandems where the front is a recliner, bikes with scoops on the front or side saddle on the back, large enough to take an adult. I quickly got used to dogs as passengers, but the prize for riskiest behaviour has to be split between the girl slumped forward as though for aerodynamics, who was busily texting with both thumbs, and the woman riding one-handed, while the other hand held her newborn baby to her chest. I cannot confirm with absolute certainty that she was wearing a harness. Now we're entering the tourist trap. The second most popular destination in Germany for foreigners is Rüdesheim, and its epicentre is Drosselgasse, a sort of diagon alley where they ply you with coffee and brandy. North of that is the Mäuseturm, which has a great legend about a greedy bishop and vengeful mice. Further down is the Lorelei, which is basically a big rock. Then the castles of Liebenstein and Sternberg, where the legend of 2 feuding brothers sounds like a rejected EastEnders plotline. Deutsches Eck in Koblenz is where the Mosel and Rhine meet. Eck means corner in German. The German word for flowers is Blumen, and there is a florist in Vienna called Blumeneck. If you're into your military history, this river is totemic. Every major European conflict since the Romans has regarded crossing the Rhine as a major hurdle. Perhaps this is never more true than at Remagen, where the capture of Ludendorff Bridge may have shortened World War II by months. If you want a feel for the stretch between Bonn and Düsseldorf, I suggest you watch the video for the Chemical Brothers track Star Guitar. it gets very industrial. Be advised that the Chocolate Museum and factory in Köln has no Oompa Loompas. After a frustrating and rainy day in industrial Duisburg, I hit a curb and fell off. I was fortunate. It was just scrapes and bruising, but here's top tip number 7. Don't push it. If you're tired and wet and fed up, you will make mistakes that could end your holiday there and then. Give yourself a break. Ever wondered where Anne of Cleves came from? It was Claver in Germany. Claver is also famous for a nuclear power plant that never was. In the 1970s, the West Germans poured billions of Deutschmarks into a new fast-breeder reactor. It got delayed, and then Chernobyl happened and the whole project was scrapped, except that they still had the cooling towers and the major buildings. So a Dutch guy bought it and turned it into Kernys Familienpark, a sort of atomic Alton Towers. Kern is German for nuclear. Watch out for the border into Holland at Millingen an der Rhine. I sailed past it and didn't realise I was in the Netherlands until all the shop names looked like minor characters in Game of Thrones. Also have €5 ready to bribe the ferry captain, not to wait 2 hours for the next scheduled crossing, but to take you there and then. The cycling rush hour in Arnhem is a test of nerve. A solid block of nose-to-tail bikes moving at speed while scooters in the opposite direction play chicken as they overtake and swing into your lane. And in the middle of all this, the school kids to your right start pulling wheelies. My favourite stop in Holland was the gorgeous little town of Schoonhoven. I've never been able to pronounce it correctly, which made its money in the silver trade. Order a huge plate of garlic king prawns at the Cafeteria Brasserie down at the riverfront and watch the sunset over the barges. Then as you head to your accommodation, listen out for the carillon in the town centre. Again, magical. Officially, the trip finishes at the end of a 2-kilometre pier at Hoek van Holland. You're not supposed to cycle down it, but I did. If you're taking the whole ferry, it's on the other side of the harbour. To ride this adds an extra 30 kilometres. Don't bother. There's a small local ferry that'll take you across. Last tip. Treat yourself to a posher room on the ferry home for 2 reasons. The first is you've earned it. The second is that P&O allow you to change the return date free if you need to. I came home a day early and it didn't cost anything more. That's it, really. Remember, be safe, be considerate, have fun. It is your holiday after all. And if someone as inept as me can do it, so can you.
I'm Gavin Wood. I'm a cycling development officer. I work in local government and I've been involved in cycling development work for about 15 or 16 years in various guises. I've worked for cycling charity and now I'm in local government up in West Yorkshire.
Now, in the context of we've had the COP26 conference in recent days or about to take place. That's all on a global level, but clearly there are things that we can do on a local level which potentially could have a massive impact. If everybody makes a small difference, then collectively the impact is a big one. But on a local level, one of those things that we can do is obviously adopt a more sustainable way of transport. We're not talking necessarily about everybody giving up their cars, but there are things that everybody can do which involve becoming a bit more environmentally conscious with their habits, walking, cycling, what have you, using public transport. But the problem I have on a local level here in West Yorkshire is the fact that perhaps it's because I'm aware of what's going on elsewhere. I've been to the Netherlands, I've been to Denmark, I've travelled in lots of different countries on the continent, and I always get a bit exasperated when I see what could be done here, but what isn't being done, and the amounts of money, for example, that are being thrown at the problem here in Britain compared to elsewhere. So why do you think that is, and what particular issues do you think we have here in Britain that we need to deal with in order to kind of move in the direction of some of our European neighbours?
That's a very good question. I too are often similarly exasperated, and I've travelled in those other countries as well that I would always describe as being first world countries when it comes to transport and transport choice. I think we've spent decades planning for everyone to travel by car. I thinking that was the key to freedom. Now we're in 2021 and we've spent those decades doing that. It's dawned on us that doesn't necessarily work. So I think we need to invest heavily in public transport. I think we need to invest heavily in alternative modes of transport away from the private car, and there needs to be continued investment for decades to come to kind of unpick those decades that we've spent planning for people to travel by car. And I think that's the only way we will get to that end game of giving people much more choice when it comes to transport. Because I don't blame anyone necessarily for choosing to travel by car now, because that they're operating in the system, in the transport system that we all operate in, and that's nudging them and pushing them towards doing that. So unpicking that, I think, is going to take a long time. And ultimately, I think it is capital investment that will change that. And meanwhile, we need to do the sort of what I would term softer measures, so some of the more kind of encouragement work, till we get to that point where people do travel sustainably because it's a sensible, economic, convenient thing to do.
Have we made improvements in the past 5, 10, 15, 20 years? Have things really changed? We do begin to see more cycle lanes, but are people embracing it, or do we still need to go a heck of a lot further, like they've done in London, where there has been a massive increase in the number of people cycling, for example, but it's after they've thrown hundreds of millions of pounds at the problem. Are we anywhere near getting there yet? Have things improved?
Yeah, that London thing, I would say they have invested a lot of money, and generally investment in things like active travel does pay back the public purse. So whilst it sounds like a lot of money up front, ultimately that money will be paid back to the public purse in improved health, improved air quality, reduced congestion and stuff like that. In answer to your question locally, I think we have made incremental improvements, is what I would say. I think it's a tricky tanker to turn, but once you get it turning, and once you get more people doing it, it's then much easier to justify future investment. So there are small incremental improvements. So on the cycle routes that we've built locally do show a steady increase in numbers, but it is really steady. And I think it's back to that comment about we've spent decades planning for people to travel by car. That's now ingrained culturally and is really culturally embedded. And to undo that kind of cultural embedding is going to take another generation, because you've got kind of a generation of people for whom just grabbing the keys to the car, regardless of trip purpose, trip distance, is a really normal thing to do. So I think if we saw, or it's often held up as a criticism, why are we spending money doing that because no one does it? And the argument for that is, well, actually, you're trying to both stimulate demand and unlock latent demand for doing it. So there's a lot of support for doing it, or a lot of people would say, I would ride a bike, but I don't feel safe. So that's your latent demand for doing it. And if you can get a good proportion of those people doing it who said they'd do it because they feel safer, then you're beginning to justify that investment. And also, if you thought about that investment as for the future, so if you think about kids cycling to school, if you can get kids seeing it as a normal thing to do, they will grow up viewing it as a normal thing to do, and they'll probably turn into the sort of utility cyclists of the future. But again, it's not normal for them to do it. So, but the more we sort of invest and the more normal it becomes, the easier it is for other people to think, hey, it is a normal thing. I'm not kind of doing this weird fringe activity, which if, you ride a bike, I ride a bike, sometimes it does feel a little like I'm on the fringe of society doing it.
My name is Laurence Warren, a touring cyclist of many years, living in Austria. Just over 50 years ago, while travelling overland to Australia in a tired old VW Combi van, I met Colin Martin, and I would like to tell you his story. Listening to the discussions in the Cycling Europe podcast, I can't help comparing it with the way it was 50 years ago. Life was simpler then. Without the internet, mobile phones, the need to take and post pictures for Instagram or Facebook, finding a power supply to charge up the laptop, navigating with a GPS rather than with a map, and paying your way with local currency because credit cards were a thing of the future. Without apps like TripAdvisor, finding accommodation, a campsite or a friendly B&B was a hit and miss affair, or meant carrying a pile of guidebooks. So how did cyclists manage before the technology took over? Back in the 60s, Dervla Murphy rode from Dunkirk to Delhi and had some incredible adventures. Later, Anne Mustoe, in her 50s, set off on her bike for Rome and ended up circling the globe twice and kept on riding. Josie Dew, in the 90s, loaded her bike with everything, including the kitchen sink, and toured in the USA, Europe and Japan. They all chose to travel alone, and their books are inspiring. In 1970, Colin Martin, an experienced amateur racing cyclist, decided at the age of 20 to ride alone from Wiltshire to Australia on a small-wheeled Moulton bike. How he came to decide on making the journey remains a mystery. But Alex Moulton, the bike's designer, was a friend of the family, and the Moulton Marathon had a number of features which made it ideal. This was before the days of the space frame Moultons. Colin, who lives in Cairns, northern Queensland, is unable to record a monologue at present, so we have worked together to produce this report. About his bike, he writes, "The Marathon proved to be a very reliable, efficient and comfortable bicycle. The strength of the small wheels for riding on many rough roads and tracks, the comfort of the suspension during long daily rides, the low centre of gravity when fully laden, peace of mind, taking a few minutes to separate the frame and store the bike in the front of my tent with me at night." Colin continues, Alex Moulton's aim was to create an efficient and comfortable expedition bicycle, which would carry lightweight and durable equipment for travelling, feeding, sleeping and resting. The complete pack weighed about 25 kilograms. The two halves of the machine, plus some kit, fell within the 20 kilograms free airline luggage allowance, and the balance of 5 kilograms was acceptable as cabin luggage. The Marathon used the familiar Mark III Moulton design with 16-inch diameter wheels and a new triangular frame suspension unit behind the seat tube. The transmission was unusual. A Fichtel and Sachs 2-speed automatic rear hub with a combined back pedal brake, which, with a double chainring and 2 sprockets, provided a choice of 2 sets of gears. By appropriate choice of chain wheel and sprocket sizes, a high gear and a low gear is obtained by slipping the wheel forward and moving the chain manually. He says, "I carried a spare rear hub, but to reduce weight, I ceremoniously buried it in the desert near Kandahar, Afghanistan. I hope a soldier didn't try to defuse it. A Mafak driver brake was fitted to the front wheel, with the pivots brazed onto the frame. The tyres were a new Dunlop nylon-corded high pressure with 80 psi with natural rubber tubes. These tyres gave me over 2,000 miles of riding before replacement. I carried 3 spare tyres and picked up extras in New Delhi. The Swedish Turbo G66 double skin tent weighed just over 3 pounds, with sufficient space to house me and the 2 halves of the bicycle in comfort and out of the weather. The telescopic pole was carried inside the seat tube. The sleeping bag was an Arctic 610 from the same company. A small petrol stove sat in a cage between the panniers, and a metal bottle on the seat tube carried fuel. This stove lasted many years until, on a cycling trip in Nova Scotia, The fuel bottle was too close to the stove while cooking my evening meal. A fireball erupted near my tent, and an elderly gentleman with a baseball bat hit the stove about 30 yards through the air. A canteen, plate, pot, pan, cup and cutlery were stored under the rear rack. The saddle was a Unica, which I had used for quite a few years while road racing in the West Country of England. It's horses for courses when it comes to saddle comfort, but this plastic saddle served me well. The front panniers and rear bag were made by Fjällräven. The latter was a backpack with shoulder straps. I remember walking through customs when I entered Australia. The Moulton under one arm and the small backpack hanging on my shoulder. The customs officer looked up from a pile of suitcases and said, "Now that's the only way to travel." How right he was. As for keeping in touch with the family back home, overlanders like Colin and I could only contact friends and family in case of crisis and with extreme difficulty. Most of the time, friends and family didn't even know what country we travellers were in. Overlanders in those days were out on their own and had to deal with difficulties as they arose. In 1970, the hippie trail overland to India and on to Australia was well worn. But knowledge of the experiences of others making the journey was less accessible than it would be now. The internet today provides so much opportunity for travellers to give daily updates on progress, which is freely available to anyone who wants to know. 50 years ago, the occasional postcard home was as good as it got. So for Colin, setting off on a bike ride overland to Australia was much more a journey into the unknown than it would be today. However, the grapevine was strong, and travellers from Australia heading for Europe were useful sources of information. We often heard about Colin from other people. I'd been travelling with my wife Irmgard for 6 months along the hippie trail overland to Asia in our weary 1960 Combi. As well as Colin, there were plenty of fascinating people along the way with a variety of travel modes. There was a Swiss guy on a Lambretta scooter. He had gone for a holiday in Italy and never stopped heading east. Last seen in Afghanistan. The highly efficient German team had brought hammocks to sleep in, but failed to realise there were no trees in the desert to hang them from. A guy riding a penny farthing was hauled up by the military in Yugoslavia for spying. His high riding position enabled him to see over the wall of the barracks. The old London bus that got stuck under a bridge, the 1920s Foden steam wagon searching for fuel. The list goes on and on. On his 21st birthday, Colin was riding up to 2,500 metres on Austria's highest mountain, the Großglockner, where he camped. Then on into Yugoslavia, where he had encounters with the police, and Greece, where he was chased by a goat, before reaching Istanbul. In those days, with no bridges over the Bosphorus, crossing on the ferry to land in Asia was a significant step into an adventure. Colin says that touring cyclists have a fear and fondness relationship with dogs. But fear went off the scale in Turkey when 3 wild dogs chased him. He says, "Sprinting like a madman, legs spinning furiously, muscles burning, dog jaws drooling and growling near my heels, my bike pump, my weapon of choice, swinging in my hand. I thought it was the end of my journey, ripped apart by feral canine thugs. Pulling bread out of my front pannier, I threw it. Not looking behind, I continued my frenzied dash. Stopping on the crest of a hill, the dogs were watching me from the bottom of the slope. I jumped on my bike as they resumed the chase. Pedalling like a maniac, life or death. It was a few kilometres before I looked round again. They were in the middle distance, walking away from me." Colin says when he daydreamed about his ride to Australia, the sun was always shining and the sky was always blue. The reality was incessant heavy rain in France. The sky bruised with dark clouds, thousands of blurred yellow headlights, wheels splashing through puddles, soggy socks, a sultry mood. When darkness arrived, I sheltered in a bus stop. Across the road, a cafe. Under the warm yellow light, patrons enjoyed wine and dined. Music and laughter drifted through the drizzle, permeating my damp clothes and filling me with sadness. A black Labrador suddenly appeared out of the darkness, soaking and shivering. Lying down in front of me on the dry shelter floor, the dog seemed dejected also. I stroked his neck and said, "You can come with me if you like. Just think of the adventures you would have meeting St. Bernards in the Alps, Afghan hounds in Afghanistan, and you could chase kangaroos in Australia." With the comfort of my new companion, I slowly fell asleep. Colin's route took him across Turkey and into Iran near Mount Ararat, and on to Tehran and from there into the Elbrus Mountains, pedalling ever towards the rising sun. The sandy road out of Iran towards Afghanistan was hundreds of kilometres of big corrugations. Heavy trucks and buses roared along in a thick cloud of sand and dust. The dust cloud surrounding oncoming vehicles often hid another overtaking on the wrong side. For Colin, on a bike, it would be suicidal, and this was the only stretch along the way that he put his bike on top of a bus. The bus paused for custom formalities at the Afghan border. Colin, with his unusual passport and documents, took some time to get through the interrogations, and when he came out, the bus had gone, with the molten and luggage on top. Just imagine the feeling. Colin sat in the dust at the roadside and wondered what to do. On journeys like this, something usually happens. Some hours later, after making a stop in Herat, the bus returned with Colin's bike and gear all intact. Afghanistan had one surfaced road that ran from Herat in the west, 600 kilometres to Kandahar in the south, and another which linked Kandahar with Kabul, the same distance away. Everyone heading east took this road through baking bare desert with very little between the cities. The legendary French student rally from Paris to Kabul took place that summer, with 494 tiny 2CV cars tearing along the dirt roads over the Elbrus Mountains in Iran and across the Afghan deserts. These cars passed Colin with a hoot and a wave and sometimes stopped for a chat. At night, sleeping out in the open, not far from the road, he would see the yellow headlamps and hear the whirring of the little engines. In India, bicycles were the most common means of mobility, pulling rickshaws, transporting goods and daily travel on large black flying pigeons bikes made in China. They had big wheels. Colin's Molten had small wheels. A big-wheeled bike was faster than one with little wheels, or so many people thought. As Colin rode out of one village, someone on the same road would enter into an unspoken race, but only to the next village. As Colin pedalled out of that village, another might join him. It was exhausting, he says. They were only going maybe 5 kilometres, and I was having to race this informal relay team all day. With a student's card purchased for a few rupees in India, it was possible to take a cheap flight with Burma Airways to Rangoon and on to Bangkok, as there were no through roads at the time. From there, it was just another 1,800 steamy kilometres to Singapore. Colin and I travelled together by ship from Singapore, and when docked on Australia's west coast, Colin set off in December, the hottest month, to ride 4,000 kilometres to Bondi Beach on the Pacific coast in Sydney. But he didn't make it. At a stop in Coolgardie, a remote mining ghost town of a few hundred souls, Shortly before crossing the Nullarbor Plain, the bike was stolen. Colin's arrival in Sydney wasn't quite the triumphant roll onto the beach that he had planned. But this was not the end of the story. After living some years in the tropical northern city Darwin, where he spent many months building a boat to sail home in, on Christmas Day 1974, Cyclone Tracy blew the boat and most of Darwin into oblivion. Colin's story about this dramatic night you can find on his Facebook page. Later, in 2002, when living in Cairns, it was time to complete his journey around the world, and with a new space frame Moulton, Colin began riding from Vancouver to New York, a journey of more than 5,000 kilometres across the Rockies and Midwest. For the final legs, he was joined by his wife Marie. This still wasn't the end of the tale. Colin had not ridden around the world. There was a gap between Coolgardie and Bondi Beach. So one October in 2008, when the winds were most favourable from the Indian Ocean, he returned to Perth and began the final link in his journey. Only the winds that year were blowing the wrong way. Just imagine sitting out into a strong headwind on a straight 145 kilometres long. His arrival on Bondi was almost the end of the story. Some years ago, the original Moulton Marathon was found to be an exhibit in a bike museum in Tokyo. Colin was invited to visit and went for a ride as guest of honour with the Moulton Bike Club members. The simplicity of riding a bike from country to country on a very tight budget, alone and without the means to contact your home, through mountains and deserts, across plains, through towns and villages, coping with emotional as well as geographical ups and downs. Doing the journey for yourself and not as an influencer, for sponsors or to gain likes. This is adventure pure. It requires self-dependency, self-confidence, and most of all, determination. Colin is a very unassuming man. He has rarely spoken of his achievements, which later also included a ride to the highest road in the Himalayas. Now, unwell and unable to record it himself, he has assisted me with producing this monologue, which I hope inspires others, as Colin has inspired me. It was him that started me on cycling, after all. Thank you for listening.
You do hear people, especially on social media, where people, have all got opinions. You do hear a lot of people say, "Oh, well, I regularly drive down the road into Pudsey, for example, and I never see anybody on the cycling superhighway that links Leeds and Bradford." I mean, that is not necessarily a valid opinion, but is it an opinion that's also expressed and shared by the people who do make the decisions, i.e. the politicians? Do you hear politicians locally saying that kind of thing? Are they as enthused as me and you, or do they just pay lip service to it?
I'm probably going to neatly sidestep that question and sort of say, people do, like any piece of infrastructure, infrastructure spends time being empty. If you look at a piece of railway line, a lot of the time you could stand there for 10, 15 minutes and you won't see a train. And then when you do see a train, it's just shifted 1,000 people. So, and similarly, I think with cycling infrastructure, there'll be times of the day when you don't see anyone using it. But there'll also be times of the day when you see lots of people use it. And they're efficient shifters of people as well. So they don't tend, like with driving, you get big, long queues. The main road, 200 metres from where we're sat, there are big queues any time of day. But you don't get that with a cycle lane. But I'm going to sidestep the question about politicians sharing that. The other thing, that there are counters. So subsurface mounted counters, and they count the number of trips.
Well, I was about to ask you actually about counters, because there are some good practice examples of things like, apart from the more obvious things like very good cycle lanes, and London is the example, but perhaps increasingly in a place like Manchester and other places as well. But one of the things that we don't seem to have adopted, or I've never seen them in West Yorkshire, are those cycling counters that are visible for people to see. Any chance of any of those, do you think, in the near future?
They're called totems, and they cost quite a lot of money. So I would say they're not imminent. So currently the cycle counters that we have are subsurface mounted. You ride over it, it forms a loop and it ticks over, and that information is then downloaded.
But the problem the problem there is that your average car driver can't see it. And your average cyclist can't feel smug about cycling past and getting the counter ticked off another notch.
Yeah, no, I accept that. So, and it would be really good if there was a big visible visible thing that when you cycled over, it ticked over and you were given, like a virtual high five for doing it, and that kind of sense of smug satisfaction. But yeah, they cost a lot of money as well. So, and it's down to, you've got a limited pool of resources. What's the best way? Although arguably, having something that's visible that would help, that would be a literal reminder and a literal rebuttal of anyone who says they're not used, would be quite useful.
Yeah, well, I think that's the main aim of them, isn't it? The fact that it just is the easiest way to turn around to somebody who's sceptical and say, well, actually, that counter there has recorded 500 people since the beginning of this morning, and it's a very easy way of showing it. Just going back to the politicians thing, I know you don't want to make comment there because obviously you work in the area and you are a civil servant and you're not allowed to do that, but do our politicians, again on a local level, or perhaps even on a national level, do you think they ever get an opportunity to see what is going on in places like the Netherlands, in Denmark? Do they engage with things like the European Cyclist Federation? Are they actually working on that level? Or do you think they're just working in a fairly closed environment where they don't realise how different it could be?
I think, like the general population, there'll be a continuum. There'll be people who are very aware of best practice in more developed nations, and I think there will be people who operate blissfully unaware that 200-300 kilometres from here is a country where a third of kids are riding to school on a fabulously well engineered network that separates all modes that I would love to see in the UK.
Would it be money well spent if they, rather than spending another £500,000 on yet another consultation, because one of my criticisms is the fact that we spend so much time consulting about things and actually it delays just getting on and doing these things. Do you think that money would be better spent if it provided money for, say, every councillor in Calderdale, where I come from, to be shipped off to Amsterdam for the weekend? I'm sure they'd enjoy it and actually see what it could be like 20, 30 years in the future.
I think that'd be pretty good, actually. So interestingly, as part of the LC WIP process, the local cycling and walking infrastructure plan process, so hired as part of that process was a Dutch consultancy to come over and speak to local government officers about how to best plan a network. And also interestingly, they did say, we have our way of doing things in the Netherlands, but really you've got to find your way of doing it as well. So I think it would be useful for people to go over and just to see how the sort of network operates and see some of those stuff that when I go to the Netherlands, I really enjoy just watching, people interacting on bikes and on foot and kind of how it all works. I just find it, fascinating. And I think, it would be good for them to actually, to then crystallise that in their heads and think, that should be the vision. That should be, a commute or a school run in Halifax, in Brighouse, in, wherever.
I think a better place for them to go actually would perhaps be Copenhagen.
Yeah.
Because in Copenhagen, when I went, the most surprising thing I found, I was expecting to get into Copenhagen and to rarely see a car, but I didn't. Copenhagen was a really busy city from the perspective of having lots of traffic. But they'd managed to integrate the cycling network in a way that didn't ban cars from really much of the city centre.
Yeah, I think getting away from this notion that planning for people to travel not by car is banning cars. I think there's a kind of a pervasive attitude that local authorities are anti-car or government's anti-car and there's a war against the motorist. That is like so far from the truth. I think it's about giving people choice, which I think they have managed really well in the Netherlands, in northern Germany, in Copenhagen. You know, people still drive. There's still car ownership. There's car ownership at the same levels as the UK. Just those cars then aren't used for every single trip, you know, regardless of distance and purpose. You know, when you've got to shift a fridge 10 miles, then yeah, you're going to use your car. When you're going to nip to the shops a mile and a half to buy a pint of milk or buy whatever, you're going to walk or you're going to cycle. And when you want to do that, the infrastructure is there and you're enabled to do it through that.
My name's Caroline Burrows. I also write under the name Verse Cycle. And this monologue's a short piece loosely based on a commute I used to do to work. It's called False Flat. The bike's cassette whirs, a soft sound overwhelmed by the roar from the acceleration of a certain type of engine. I tense automatically. Past it goes, too fast, too close, shiny silver hubcaps and the badge of proof, blue and white checks in a circle. Another big massive wheel sucker getting all proprietary on the road. The whisper of my bike reassures me. I loosen my grip and click down the gears, click, 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 until there are none left as I climb the hill, pushing down on the pedals I'm clipped into. I imagine I'm scraping gum off the soles of my shoes on the pull-up for maximum power. I read that somewhere once. Good advice. It's harder to climb well when it's like this. Doubtful I'll get a personal best today. Something to do with cold air irritating the lungs. My panting now dominates, bellowing out of me in white puffs. This hill's a real chest buster. Coffee's in the air. I can almost taste it on my tongue with my mouth gaping open from this effort. I know I'm on time because I recognise a man with wild grey hair sitting outside a cafe up ahead opposite my office, where the hill levels out into a false flat. He's bundled up in layers, all shades of grey matching the tarmac and pavement. He drags on a thin roll-up, a stream of smoke accompanied by a hacking cough on his exhale. The closer I get, the fag smoke corrupts the scent of caffeine. I've been noticing its absence when he isn't there, which is more often than not recently. He lifts a porcelain mug to his mouth, a patchy beard clinging to his sunken cheeks. Does he set his clock by my gasping too? Does the smell of my sweat wafting over him ruin his coffee? I draw level, him huddled over his hot drink, me hunched over my bike. It's like some odd parallel universe, almost as if we're sitting together. I wheeze past the grubby rucksack dumped on the pavement, his stained sleeping bag spilling out of it, and keep pedalling as the incline kicks up again with 1 kilometre to go. I crest the top of the hill. It's not a personal best. Try again tomorrow. I make a U-turn that cars can't get away with, not even BMWs, and freewheel back down to the office, my daily dose of exercise all too quickly done. I lock my bike up and go over to the cafe. He's not there anymore. Never is by the time I get back. He's been replaced by a new man in shades of grey, but this one's well turned out, in a wool coat paired with a scarf neatly knotted, clean shaven, ready to take on the day. He gives my tight cycling thermals an appreciative once-over with a small nod. A few minutes can make all the difference to a daily routine. It's doubtful he's aware of who is sitting there just before him. The porcelain coffee cup's the same, but the roll-up's now a perfect-looking cigarette. A pack of Marlboro Red is placed proudly on the table beside a set of keys, the fob displaying what type of car he drives, which I could have guessed. He blows his cigarette smoke in my direction like it's a slow breeze. I wrinkle my nose at the chemical smell and push the cafe's door open into a wall of warmth. I order my usual, a latte to take away and a coffee for someone who's homeless, please, and then I go back out into the cold, cross back over the road and go to work. My name's Caroline Burrows. I write under the name First Cycle, and you can find me on all the social medias at First Cycle, First for poetry and Cycle for bicycle. Thank you.
Do you think people have a valid point when they say, oh, well, in the Netherlands, in Copenhagen, it's nice and flat and, I was going to say it doesn't rain as much, but it probably does rain just as much in Amsterdam and Copenhagen that it currently is doing here in West Yorkshire. Are those valid arguments that people come up with? And if they are, what can we do to address them? Obviously, we can't change geography or, in the short term, the climate.
So the rain, we have a broadly similar amount of rain days in the UK as we do in lowland Europe. So you are equally likely to go out on your bike and get wet in Copenhagen as you are in Bradford. So I think that's a little bit of a red herring. And I also think people shouldn't use their car as a coat. You know, we've got jackets and brollies and all manner of other stuff that you could use that you wouldn't get wet. The geography is a definite barrier. But I think it is often overstated. So, and I think people don't just ride bikes in the Netherlands because it's flat. It's also really windy in the Netherlands, and that can be a real pain in the backside when you ride there. So I think people ride bikes in the Netherlands because it's engineered to happen. And I think similar would happen in West Yorkshire or any other metropolitan area in the UK. That being said, it is a barrier, and I think things like e-bikes are really going to help unlock some of those people who say, I would ride a bike, but I live in the Upper Calder Valley and there are hills that are 25%. So, and I think it will really help unlock some of those people to do that. And I think as e-bikes become more prevalent, which they definitely are, the technology will become more sophisticated, the economies of scale will kick in, and the price will come down, and they'll be more accessible.
And it's worth pointing out in terms of, again, West Yorkshire, where we live, that the geography of the place, it didn't stop the engineers of the 18th century building canals. We've got plenty of canals, and it didn't stop the Victorians from building lots of railway lines. So really, why should it stop people or the current authorities from investing serious amounts of money in a cycle network and an active travel network that is, again, predominantly flat? You can't send canals up hills. You can't really send trains up very steep hills, but yet we have an infrastructure which is quite an extensive network. Perhaps it should be that we should be adopting those lines of communication, the canals and the disused railway lines, more than we currently are. Any thoughts on that?
My genuine thought would be I wish we'd reopen some of those railway lines, I think, and possibly reopen them with cycling infrastructure alongside. So I think that would then, you'd be back into that sphere of, more local kind of public transport lines and greater transport choice. So I'd probably rather see those railway lines reopened, I think. But yeah, with then active travel corridors alongside, which is something I found in Germany quite a lot, with cycle lanes alongside railway lines, which, when you step back from being a user, it makes a lot of sense because often they're really direct.
Hi, I'm Robin. I live in London and I've been cycle touring with my partner Erica since 2013. Our first experience was cycling from London to Paris, and we were bitten by the cycle touring bug so much that the next year we packed in our jobs and headed off on a 4-month adventure, taking a rather scenic route from Bordeaux in southwest France to the channel port of Dunkirk. On our journey, we cycled as far east as Vienna before turning north, heading towards Hamburg and eventually home. In total, we travelled through 7 countries and rode over 6,000 kilometres. Our trip took us on many well-known and popular cycling routes, but we also spent time a little off the beaten track. One of the countries we visited was Czechia, previously the Czech Republic, where we spent 2 weeks crossing between Austria and Germany. To give an indication of our route, we entered the country almost due north of Vienna, then started a clockwise loop, tracking close to the border with Austria and eventually the border with Germany. We then headed inland towards Prague. From Prague, we rode north, crossing into Germany alongside the River Elbe. I'd like to share my experiences of Czechia in the context of the 4 things that I think make for a good cycle tour. Firstly, and most obviously, good cycling, ideally on cycle paths and quiet roads. Next, interesting places to visit, places that aren't on the usual tourist trail. I like to experience the local culture through food and drink, so I want to have plenty of opportunities for both. And finally, it should be easy to find somewhere to stay, either camping or B&Bs, and ideally not too expensive. So let's start with good cycling. A particularly pretty stretch of cycling was after the popular tourist stop of Český Krumlov in the southwest of the country. Here we climbed into the Šumava National Park, which runs just alongside the border with Germany. It's the largest national park in Czechia, and a network of cycle paths crisscrosses the area. We followed Route 33, which takes quiet roads, forest trails, and even 1 or 2 cobbled sections up through the park. The cycling was quite tough, as we had to haul our heavily laden bikes up several climbs, at one point reaching close to 4,000 feet. On one of the steeper sections, we discovered that the Czechs prefer to ride in one direction only, downhill, and use the bus to get their bikes to the top. We eventually had our own version of this, descending for almost 30 kilometres as we left the park heading towards the city of Pilsen. We really enjoyed our time in the Šumava, riding through dense forest where locals were picking mushrooms and alongside mountain streams. We even read that the area has a population of lynx, although unfortunately we weren't lucky enough to see any. Next, interesting places to visit. There are a number of pretty towns dotted along the southern edge of the country, including tiny Slavonice, which is situated on an old trade route between Prague and Vienna. We arrived here after a day of riding through unspoilt countryside close to the border with Austria. This area was fortified after World War II and once formed part of the Iron Curtain. The Renaissance buildings in Slavonice's main square date back to the 16th century and are decorated with sgraffito, a technique which involves scratching the outer layer of the building to reveal a contrasting colour underneath. It's used to draw intricate designs on the buildings, including artwork and scenes from the Bible. We spent the night here, dining at a cafe whose breakfast menu included a Cuban breakfast, a curious combination of a shot of rum, a cigar, and the loan of a picture of Fidel Castro. Although we picked something else, I'm sure that this would be a great way to kickstart a day's cycling. Ride 20 miles north of Slavonice, past fields of corn and forests of strongly scented pine trees, and you'll find Telch, one of the prettiest places we visited on the entire trip. Larger than Slavonice, the main square is packed full of more 16th century buildings, this time in pastel shades of blue, yellow, red and green. Many have gabled roofs, with colonnades at ground level, and shops, bars, cafes, restaurants, and even our B&B contained within. We visited Telch during the town's annual folk festival, and took some time out of cycling to spend the afternoon soaking up the atmosphere, watching music and theatrical performances taking place in the main square. The next thing I enjoy is good food and drink, and if you like to finish a tough day's cycling with a glass of something cold, then Czechia does not disappoint. Czech beer has a great reputation worldwide, and we were lucky to stay in 3 towns with links to the brewing industry: České Budějovice, Třebon, and Pilsen. České Budějovice is home to the Budweiser Budva Brewery, and having set our sights on a tour, we cycled 20 miles through absolutely torrential rain in order to get there on time. The tour covered all parts of the brewing process, including a very clever closed-loop recycling program, where returned bottles are cleaned and relabeled before being filled with beer and dispatched nationwide. But by far the best part is getting an ice cold sample in the cellar where the beer is matured before being bottled. This more than made up for us getting soaked to the skin on the ride there. Those who prefer wine are also well catered for. Our first night in Czechia was in Mikulov, 2 kilometers from the Austrian border. It's another pretty town with a huge castle overlooking the centre. Mikulov is close to the main wine-growing areas of the country, and we spent an enjoyable evening on the terrace of a cafe tasting a selection of crisp white wines produced in the local area. Finally, accommodation. Up until this point, we've been camping as much as possible in order to stay within our budget, but we found campsites to be few and far between. Wild camping isn't really our thing, so we ended up staying in more B&Bs and pensions than usual. Not necessarily an issue, because they were well priced and good quality. We never struggled to find a place for the night, but generally booking online worked better than through tourist information centres. However, after a while, we started to get tired of finding accommodation every evening, and longed for the quiet simplicity and lower cost of camping. On one day in particular, we found ourselves riding in temperatures of over 30°C with a fierce headwind to zap our energy, and in the early afternoon we were feeling low and lethargic. To brighten our mood, I found a campsite on my phone, and we took a detour with the intention of spending the night there. The detour involved a long climb, and you can imagine our disappointment when the place I found turned out not to be a campsite, but a children's holiday park. Given the trouble riding there, we did not take this news particularly well. On the way to the campsite, we passed a hotel. As we retraced our steps, we stopped outside and decided to ask about a room. It turned out that they did have a room available, but there was some kind of event taking place that evening. As we don't speak Czech, we weren't sure about exactly what was happening, but didn't really want to ride further to find somewhere else, so we took the room on offer. The event turned out to be a concert from a local rock group, and we ended up spending the evening listening to the band, drinking, dancing, and hanging out with a crowd of Czech rock fans who certainly didn't expect to find a pair of English cyclists in their midst. I hope this gives a good overview of our experiences in Czechia. Unlike other parts of Europe, we didn't come across many other touring cyclists. Only 2 sets in the entire 2 weeks. We met 2 guys from London who had just set out on a very long ride to Vietnam, and a German couple who spend a few weeks each year cycling the EuroVelo 13 Iron Curtain Trail. I hope that our experience shows that the country offers plenty of excitement for touring cyclists, from pretty towns to national parks, and I hope that it might encourage you to consider it for your next trip.
I get frustrated that where we do throw money at things, and there are some decent examples, there's a really good cycle lane that heads in this direction towards the north of Bradford, from the centre of Bradford, and they're going to invest more, I think, in the West Bradford cycle superhighway. That was announced this week as part of the budget, I think. And in Calderdale, where I come from, there are examples of, fairly decent cycle infrastructure beside the canal, for example, and you've got the Hebble Trail, which goes into the centre of Halifax. No, we're not fantastic at building these things. There are examples of these things having been built, but what we aren't good at is maintaining them. And I could take you to the Hebble Trail, and there's a massive ditch on the Hebble Trail, which has been repaired in the past. It needs completely rebuilding again. Do you think it's a valid criticism to say a lot more money should be spent on maintaining the cycle network as well as actually building and expanding it?
Yes, is the short answer. I think you've got to, like with any piece of infrastructure, there's a big initial capital expense. You've then got to support that with revenue funding.
Do the councillors actually appreciate that, do you think?
Oh, I don't know. I imagine they do. Again, I'd probably sidestep any criticism of any politician. I think...
Why when you're planning a new cycle route, I say why don't you? Perhaps you do. Do you allocate any of that initial funding to long-term maintenance, or is it all capital expenditure when the thing gets built?
I think there is a shortage of revenue funding to then do it, and also local authorities are increasingly cash-strapped when it comes to revenue funding.
Yeah, I mean, my favourite ditch on the Hebble Trail, it makes me smile now every time I cross it, because it's not only dangerous, but actually, if that ditch were to appear on a road, the council maintenance people would be there within hours. The fact that it's on a cycle path, it just gets ignored. But I won't push you on that one.
Yeah, I suppose that does sort of reflect where we're at as well in terms of, I call it, the product mix when it comes to travel. There'll be way more people who drive a car who are badgering the local authority to repair that piece of infrastructure, I think. So again, we're in that evolutionary process of getting more people to travel sustainably, and until that happens, we're always going to be kind of competing for pots of money and for time and resources and stuff like that.
Hi, my name's Laura, and I'm the back half of Stella Tandem, a record-breaking attempt to cycle around the world in 2022. My front half is Stevie, my husband, and we met at a beer festival. He was drinking the beer and I was serving it. While we were there, he told me he'd cycled the length of the country from Derby to Land's End to John O'Groats and back again in 9 days, just over. I barely believed him at the time, but then he invited me to go on a tandem ride with him, and the rest is history. Since then, we've become involved in the wonderful world of Audax long-distance cycling, which you may be aware of. Events are held all over the UK and in Europe as well. We've cycled through Wales, the Pennines, Lake District, all sorts of different places on the tandem bicycle and on solo bikes, culminating in the epitome of Audax, Paris-Brest-Paris, a 1,200 kilometre bike ride from the capital city to the coast and back again. I completed this ride on my own solo bike in 92.5 hours, just outside the time limit, but an amazing achievement and certainly proof that I don't have my feet up on the back. We've also done a lot of touring. We've travelled in the south of France and climbed Ventoux, the Alpe d'Huez, with our fully laden tandem bicycle, camping along the way. On our first trip, we had a small misdemeanor with our route where the bike bus we were due to get back was not quite in the position we expected it to be. And we were left trying to ride 600 kilometres in about 30 hours. This didn't pan out so well, and it resulted in us having to reassess our options. And we sat there one cold morning thinking, how on earth are we going to get this bicycle back home? The obvious answer was to ride it. So managing to scrape a few more days together, we got on the bike and started riding north. We'd been dropped off at Narbonne on the south coast and already made it part of the way up the country, but managed to ride the rest. And a few days later, we were flying down to Calais, at 5 o'clock in the morning to catch the ferry back to the UK. It was a fantastic trip, and we had so many amazing experiences along the way, meeting locals and eating the food, drinking the wine. It really imbued in us the kind of spirit of long distance cycling and touring. Last year, we were immensely lucky to be able to squeeze in a lead jog amongst the coronavirus pandemic. We averaged about 100 miles a day, camping again along the way with everything we needed on the bike. Seeing the country at the speed of a bicycle was an absolutely epic experience. And we learnt so much about ourselves along the way on that trip too. Managing to feed ourselves, fuel ourselves and keep the pedals turning all the way until we're stood at John O'Groats on the seafront. This trip inspired us and really made us think about how far can we go on this bicycle. And hearing about Tandem Wow, the two amazing ladies who came in just before lockdown, having broken the world record for the female tandem pair to cycle around the world, we were inspired and we thought, I think we can do this too. So the seed was sown and we started to look at the journey. 18,000 miles around the world, hopefully in 180 days. That will be an epic achievement. Lots of people have said, why don't you go slower? Why don't you take your time and enjoy it? But to be honest with you, I've wangled about as much time off work as I can. And one day we will go back and do it slower. But for now, it's about the challenge. It's about can we do this? A lot of people have said, why are you doing this? And I said, because we can. But Stevie has put it even better and said, because we think we can. That element of challenge is still there. We've been inspired by Mark Beaumont, Jenny Graham, Tandem Wow, all sorts of people along the way. And we want to inspire others too. We want to take people around the world with us. If people can follow us and maybe be inspired to go on trips, tours, even shorter bike rides of their own, that would be an amazing thing. So we'd really like as many people to follow us around the world as possible. We're on social media under Stella Tandem and at www.stellatandem.com. So if you'd like to find out more about our trip and maybe follow us along the road, we'd be more than happy to have you.
When a new road scheme is being proposed and developed, is it a legal obligation to include active travel measures, cycle paths, walk-in, or can they just be, quite frankly, ignored by the authorities?
My guess would be there's no legal obligation to do it. So, but then you do have examples where, look at like the East Leeds Orbital Route, which is, it's a trunk road, but also has alongside it really good cycling infrastructure. So I think it would come down to there would be no mandate to do it, no legal compulsion to do it, but a local authority might think that'd be a really good idea. We'll do that, and it feeds into our policy around increasing numbers of people travelling by bike.
Yeah, because it would make sense. Okay, finally, if looking forward now, say we're 2021, so looking forward to say 2040, another 19 years, which seems to be, that's the either 2030 or 2040 is quoted as the time when we've got to get our greenhouse gas emissions down, and if we don't, we're all doomed. What will I see if I'm still around in 2030, 2040 on the ground in terms of people adopting more active travel ways of living?
If I'm still around as well, I think. Well, hopefully not post-climate destruction apocalypse. So hopefully we've made the right decisions that have led us, down the path of having, a much more cohesive network. I think, If you're talking about active travel specifically, currently you've got piecemeal bits of infrastructure that I think by 2040, so 20 years hence, are gonna join and fit together more cohesively. So at that point, I think when you begin to get a network rather than discrete bits of infrastructure, you are really going to get more people doing it because it's more convenient for people to hop on their bike and the infrastructure is going to take them where they need to go. So I think in 19 years' time, I would really hope that by that time we've got this cohesive network and is of really, high quality and doesn't have some of the sort of shortcomings that some of the stuff we have built in the past has. Because those shortcomings, I think, are also quite important. I think once you introduce like little weak links and sticking points, then that's enough for a lot of people to think, hey, I'm not going to do it. It's part of an evolution, I think. So the network evolves and also the quality is going to evolve as well.
And when you make your plans, is there a column which says 2040? Are you actually planning for 2040? Or are you planning for 2023, 4, 5?
I don't know the answer to that, really. And I don't do any network planning. I'm largely a guy that does the sort of softer side of things, the engagement work, with kind of a working knowledge of routes and stuff like that. So there will be, there are policies and there are strategies. So I don't know if that policy or strategy says in 2040 we'll have 1,200 miles of glorious, high-quality cycle infrastructure.
Perhaps what we need are politicians who are on a local level, who are elected for, say, 10 years, and then at least they could put long-term strategies into place. That actually might be a good thing on a national level as well. But then again, you're stuck with the people for 10 years rather than 4 years. But hey, yeah.
We operate, all the public sphere operates within the political framework, and that some aspects of that are really good and some aspects can be quite frustrating, I think, both as a kind of member of the public and a local government person too.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you. It's interesting.
Skiing is probably the first thing that comes to mind when you think of Austria. If you are old enough, you might recall the sound of music or even Mozart. Skiing means big, steep mountains. So you might think Austria is not the obvious place to go for a holiday on a bike. You'd be wrong. Between the mountains are valleys, and along the valleys are rivers, and beside the rivers are wonderful bicycle touring routes. Austria is only a small country, but it has more than its fair share of long-distance cycle trails. Austria also has borders with 8 other countries. I wonder if you can name them. This means that many routes cross borders, giving the opportunity for multi-country rides or arriving at a point where 3 countries meet. There are 5 EuroVelo routes running through the country or following Austria's borders. I am Laurence Warren, originally a Londoner, now living in Austria. I've been cycle touring with my Austrian wife Irmgard for close on 40 years. When we began, it was so simple. Few signposted bike routes, no GPS, internet or mobile phones. We just had old-fashioned paper maps, which became increasingly tatty as the days turned into weeks on the road. Cycle touring was considered rather retro before retro was cool. I've lived in the Alps nearly 20 years and cycled Austria from end to end and from top to bottom. We live in a small village at 1,000 metres. That's 400 vertical metres at a painful 12% above the Salzach Valley. We've cycled along the Rhine, the Rhone, the Moselle, the Main, the Oder-Neisse, the Elbe and Moldau in Czechia, the Po in Italy, and battled our way the 1,400 kilometres length of the former East-West German border. I've toured alone in New Zealand, Greece and Cuba. However, we have embraced some new technology. We use commute on some trips, and after years climbing the big cols in the Pyrenees, the Mont Ventoux twice, and the Alpe d'Huez, our 75-year-old knees need a bit of assistance, and in 2020 we began to use e-bikes. To our minds, Austria's offering to touring cyclists can't be beaten. Dramatic scenery, lakes and mountains, good, well-marked trails, and high-standard, affordable hospitality. Austrians are enthusiastic cyclists, and bike routes are well signposted and generally follow small farm roads or dedicated asphalt tracks. Where they are not asphalted, tracks through forests and beside meadows are generally well surfaced and maintained. Most routes are suitable for children. The country relies on tourism, and cycle touring has grown rapidly in importance in recent years. The standard of accommodation is as high as you will find anywhere: clean, efficient, welcoming, and not too expensive. Hotels, apartments, B&Bs and campsites are not difficult to find in the mountains, where the hospitality industry is geared for big numbers of skiers. If you ride on the fly, like me, without booking ahead, there should not be a problem. So what are the big river rides? The Danube flows through Austria and is a very popular summer route. It's flat, with cycle tracks on each side. Organised groups ride the 400 kilometres from Passau to Vienna, and in the high season it can be like a superhighway. From Vienna it flows to the Black Sea through many more countries. The Inn rises in Switzerland and flows through the Tyrol into Germany and joins the Danube at Passau. The Tauern-Radweg, or bike route, follows the Salzach River from the huge Krimmel waterfall to Salzburg, where it connects with the Saarlach, Inn and onto the Danube. The Drau River route runs from Italy along the southern border of Austria and on into Slovenia. The rivers Mur and Enns also have their own popular bike tracks. All these trails are 300 to 400 kilometres long. They link together so you can ride till the winter snows arrive. At peak times, these main routes can be relatively busy. With a little investigation and imagination, you will find thousands of kilometres of quiet, marked trails through beautiful, well-groomed countryside with idyllic villages, lakes, plenty of castles, churches and monasteries. But not all of Austria is mountains. To the far north of the country is the Weinviertel, quiet, rolling countryside, quaint streets of private wine press houses, the Kellergassen, and miles of vineyards and fields of sunflowers. Southeast of Vienna, along the Hungarian border, Burgenland is red wine country and famed for the huge Neusiedler Lake, which is 90 kilometres around, but just a metre deep. This is the warmest part of the country, and there are miles of bike trails here. There are so many opportunities to link marked trails to make any length of tour you wish. There are 9 provinces, and each is responsible for its cycle network and publishes detailed maps of routes. Some are numbered and others have names, like the Mozart-Radweg, which crosses into Germany. The cities too have clear, dedicated bike routes, and of course plenty of opportunities for a cultural break. Salzburg, Innsbruck, Linz, Graz and Vienna are all worth a visit. If you want a challenge, one big climb is the Großglockner, Austria's highest mountain. Rising up from the town Radweg near Zell am See, this historic road is popular with motorcyclists and tourists in summer. But if you start the 13-kilometre climb to 2,500 metres very early, you will have a quiet but spectacular ride. There are other big climbs in the Tyrol, including the Kaunertal, where after 29 bends and 1,900 vertical metres, you reach the glacier at 2,750 metres. From our village, and from many others in the mountains, there are forest roads which allow cyclists, though some roads don't, to climb to an alm or high-altitude farm, where the farmer and cattle spend their summer. There will almost certainly be a good homemade snack and a beer waiting for you there. This is a very special feature of Austria, and well worth asking where you can ride or hike up to an alm. One-way rides work well, as the local rail system is well geared to handling bikes. The regional express, Rex, and local S-Bahn trains require no forward booking, have plenty of bike space, and in most cases you can wheel your bike in. Faster trains require pre-booking and have only limited space. Most stations these days have lifts, whereas in my young day, hauling bikes and luggage up and down flights of stairs was the norm. Salzburg Airport, pre-COVID, had regular flights from London. It's a small airport used to handling skis and bikes and very user-friendly, and is well placed to start a wonderful bike tour through the mountains. Now it's time for us to set off on another trip, but I'll leave you with a warning. Once you get the bug, and you love setting off in the morning to somewhere new, not knowing where you will sleep that night, the bug will never leave you. The urge only gets stronger.
Thanks to Simon Garland, Laurence Warren, Laura Massey-Pugh, Caroline Burrows and Robin Watkins for taking the time to record their monologues. Thanks also to Gavin Wood for fending off my frustrations with the state of cycling infrastructure here in West Yorkshire. If you'd like to record your own monologue for the Cycling Europe podcast, you can find out how to do just that by visiting cyclingeurope.org/monologue. Alternatively, you can get in touch by emailing podcast@cyclingeurope.org or by posting a message either on the website itself, cyclingeurope.org, or via social media, where you'll find me at Cycling Europe. If you've enjoyed listening to this episode of the podcast or any of the previous 42 episodes, please consider making a donation to help support the podcast and the website. Details of how to do this can be found by visiting cyclingeurope.org/support. It's easy and secure, and if everyone listening to this podcast donated just £1 or $1 or €1 or one whatever you use, it would go a long way to making the Cycling Europe podcast and the website a much more sustainable endeavour. All the details can be found at cyclingeurope.org/support. And thanks if you choose to help me in that particular way. It would be much appreciated. And don't forget to rate the podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you happen to be listening. Join me again for episode 44 of the Cycling Europe podcast. In the meantime, thanks for listening, keep pedalling and happy cycling.